Hello and welcome to Liquid New Hampshire. I'm on with my guest Bill Fleming of the American Solidarity Party. And we're here to talk about what the American Solidarity Party stands for and what they are as a third party. So, Bill, what is your role within the American Solidarity Party?
So I wear a few different hats. I've been involved in the party for about 4 years, a little over 4 years, I guess now it's closer to 4.5. And when I first joined the party, um, I got involved in the Brian Carroll campaign. So I was in charge of a number of states for write-in access on that campaign. And then shortly after that, I I helped establish the state party here in Georgia, and then I got involved in the national party. So currently, I serve on the national committee. I am the party's member engagement director, which means basically I try to come up with different methods of kind of reaching out to our membership and helping them get involved as leaders, volunteers, candidates, and also giving them opportunities to learn more about how they can get involved in their local communities and bring our values into the general politics of their neighborhoods, their states, and that kind of thing.
Okay. And what would you say attracted you to the American Solidarity Party in the first place?
Yeah, so for me, I think it was with all third parties, there's a degree to which it's just how well their values match up with your personal values. At the time, I was looking for an alternative because I was in 2020. I was just very frustrated with the way that the Democratic primary had gone. Before that, I had been kind of I would say a left leaning Catholic, and so I was at that time willing to compromise on something, obviously, if I wanted to participate in politics, just because there was no party that like fully was on board with what I cared about. And so, you know, my approach at that time was, given my upbringing and my family, that was just the place that I was more comfortable. And when I saw kind of the way that the Democratic establishment coalesced and encouraged certain of their candidates to withdraw from the primary and back a particular candidate to kind of put their hand on the scale. That was kind of the last straw for me with the duopoly. And so I started looking into alternatives. I found the ASP, I read the platform, and I kind of just felt like it really resonated with me. And it was actually, I believe, that year that we adopted the statement of principles several months after I joined the party. And so the statement of principles of the American Solidarity Party is kind of like the seven general guiding principles that kind of underlie all of the platform positions. I think the Greens might have something similar, but anyway, yeah, it just the ethos of the party and the consistency of the party was kind of what drew me to it, because I always felt like the Republicans and the Democrats had kind of this odd coalition of issues that didn't really holistically fit together. And it seemed like if one party adopted one stance, the other party just adopted the opposite stance. And there was no nuance and there was no, kind of coalescing around even like a common theme to what it was that they supported.
I agree with that very strongly. I found that a lot of people do believe that there is something that ties together everybody on the left and everybody on the right. But then if you go and you ask them, well, what is that thing? They start disagreeing immediately. Like they'll be like, well, the right is about freedom and the left is about big government. And it's like, well, maybe kind of, but it's a little bit more complicated than that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, there are certain the issue I think with freedom as a concept, is that my right to swing my fist ends at the tip of the other man's nose, and
Hmm.
we can't seem to agree what the tip of the other man's nose is.
Yeah.
Like I don't think there's anybody in this country on the left or the right who would say they oppose freedom. Freedom is a fundamental American value, but whose freedom and freedom to do what? and where do we curtail that freedom for the common good? And so, like, that's one of those things that I think has just become kind of a buzzword in some ways. But yeah, it's challenging because, like, we want to say, oh well, this group is in favor of X, Y, or Z, but not everybody in that group is in favor of X, Y, or Z, and they vote for that group sometimes in spite of that because they care about the another issue that they're representing. And so, you can get like a lot, like, quite frankly, there's a lot of single issue voters out there, and I think those people, they might have an easier time kind of sticking with the main two parties just because they are so motivated by one particular thing, if that makes sense. Like, whereas for those of us that maybe um, are a little more kind of spread out in our passion, if you will, that kind of becomes a challenge.
I think a lot of people when they enter politics, maybe they start off as sort of a single issue voter, and then they see what the party that supports their issue supports, and they're kind of handed this basket of other stuff, and they just go, okay, I can support this other stuff if you guys support me, you know?
Right. Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, and I've also noticed with with myself, there's, I forget who it was that said it, but there was some quote about, like, you are kind of like an amalgamation of the five people you spend the most time with, or something like that. Like, you adopt their habits, you adopt their views as you, like, just get in deeper relationship with them, and you talk to them more, and you spend more time with them. And and so, in a weird way, that's true with politics too. Like, I've seen people, as the parties change their positions, I've seen voters who I know had like advocated for one thing in 2012, and now in 2024 they're either, just kind of repeating the talking points of their party, or they've even gotten completely on board with it as it shifted over time. And so that's something that's kind of fascinating to me, not to be like, you know, dismissive or insulting to any particular person, but I think as a collective, I think people are much more malleable than we like to think we are. We like to think we're very independent thinking, but there is safety in groups, there is safety in numbers, and it's like probably quite evolutionary advantageous for us to fall into that, you know.
Yeah, I think we do. I think we fall into the group thing. So let's try and break up some of that group thing today by showing people a different group of politics. One issue that I noticed is different, or creates a new sort of a through line between issues that maybe a normal Democrat or Republican would see as contradictory to one another, is whole life politics, which I understand is important to a lot of American Solidarity Party members. Tell me about whole life politics.
Yeah, so whole life politics as a moniker, I think, comes from a desire to differentiate ourselves to a certain extent from the pro life movement, on the basis that a lot of critiques of the pro life movement are along the lines of, like, you're not pro life, you're just pro birth. You care about the child in the womb, but you don't care about the child in the streets, and those kind of things. So the emphasis of whole life, as opposed to strictly pro life, although most of the members of the ASP would still identify as pro life, they just, like I said, it's a more advantageous moniker to maybe, like, try to change the conversation, to say whole life. But the concept is basically like the dignity of human life from womb to tomb, or, like, kind of valuing human life. I've heard our nominee Peter Sonsky, he's been using the phrase at all ages and all stages, right? So it is like caring about the value of the life of the unborn, but it is also caring about the value of the life of the person on death row. It's about caring about the value of the life of the disabled individual, and making sure that, like, that person is not, un uh unduly coerced into kind of making kind of life-ending medical choices. It's about opposing physician-assisted suicide, because the reality, I think, for a lot of us is that we believe in the inviolable dignity of the human person. That like fundamentally, that is like what all of our politics is based on, is that human beings have inherent value and dignity, and that value and dignity needs to be respected in all aspects of politics. And so, we don't view somebody dealing with a terminal illness, like we don't view the solution to that as physician assisted suicide. We don't view the solution to finding out that your child has Down syndrome while it's in the womb. We don't view the solution to that as abortion, right? Like those things, they are, for a lack of a better word, like kind of um, alleviating the societal burden of those people, but they're not objectively good in and of themselves for those people. And so we want to see a culture where we respect life at every stage of life. And we want to see a culture where we support and empower people to live out the best life that they can live. And so, how do create a circumstance in which you have such strong communities and such strong social supports that new parents who find out that they're having a child with Down syndrome are not so terrified that they think that abortion is their only option, right?
Mm.
Because those kinds of things, like those what we know two things are true, right? At the same time, we know that individuals with Down syndrome have inherent value and dignity, and they go on to lead very happy lives, and they bring a lot of joy to the people in their lives. We also know that it can be emotionally trying at times to raise somebody with those kinds of difficulties. And so, how do we create a society, both in the local community and in the broader national context, where people feel empowered to tackle those challenges and to like do right by those people?
And what does that look like in terms of economic policy? What sorts of things does the American Solidarity Party endorse to make sure people's lives are comfortable in that way?
Yeah, so we support a economic policy which is referred to as distributism by some people. Our previous vice presidential candidate, Amar Patel, he kind of coined the phrase ownership economy, and Peter has also adopted that in some of his literature and on his website and those kind of things. And so the idea is we want, I guess maybe to give a little bit of background, distributism as a concept came out of early 20th century kind of Catholic thought mainly. So there were two main writers who kind of advanced the idea. They were G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. And so the concept is basically that you want a society of widespread property ownership. This is not some kind of equal or like totally egalitarian society per se. But like what G.K. Chesterton said on the topic was the problem with capitalism is that there are too few capitalists, right? So we want the people to own the means of their trade. We want a lot of small local self-employed people. We want those kinds of things where people have power and autonomy over their situations economically. And there is still a place in that kind of structure for larger social safety net supports, which if you go through our party's platform, you will see, the specific areas where we call for those kinds of things. We want to look into, better ways of kind of structuring our healthcare system, our education system, those kinds of things. But I think the core of it really is that concept of like a robust small business sector of the economy, because capitalism any in capitalism has this tendency toward concentration and towards monopoly, right? And so we have to actively resist that, I think. And so you get into we always talk about competition, and it's like, well, what's the healthiest economy is one where you're going to have the largest competition, which means you're going to have many more smaller businesses. And so we often as consumers don't really like that idea, because as consumers what we want is we want the economies of scale of Walmart, right? But we also don't realize like quite how much Walmart delivers those low prices by taking advantage of government subsidized highways and taking advantage of food stamps for their employees. And so there's a lot kind of tied into it, and we could go into like a million different which ways, but I think that's kind of the core philosophy. So I don't know if there's a particular aspect you'd like to dive a little deeper on.
Yeah, part of my backstory of how I became interested in this is I was interested in sort of local direct democracy, and I tried to find anyone who I could find who was writing about that. And I found anarchists, and then I
Mm-hmm.
found localists, and then I just kept looking at offshoots of that, and eventually I found distributists. And I was impressed by how much overlap there was between conservative localist political thought, Catholic distributist political thought, and then these like libertarian socialist political thinkers were all sort of stumbling upon the same like local worker cooperatives and family owned enterprises are preferential to large corporations. That sort of conclusion was sort of spread across all these different traditions. Um, One of the things I was drawn to about distributism in particular is that they seemed a bit more comfortable with maybe placing their thumb on the scale compared to some more libertarian thinkers in support of small business. There are some people in like voluntarist libertarian circles who will tell you they agree that they think businesses should be smaller, but the only thing they're willing to do in the direction of that is just remove big government barriers and sort of embrace the free market.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think they are right about part of that, right? Like the reality is that the current economic system, a lot of the proponents of capitalism, just like a lot of the proponents of communism, will say, well, that's not real capitalism or that's not real communism, right? Um, but the reality is they want to label it like crony capitalism or whatever. We can put that to the side for a minute. I don't really care about the label. The reality is that the economy that we have today is one in which the government does put its hand in the scale on the scale, often in favor of the large corporations. And so they are right to be concerned about that. I think what where I get concerned, and it sounds like where you get concerned, is thinking that like we don't need to worry about private consolidation of power,
mm,
right? And there's a book, Goliath by Matt Stoller. He's kind of a conservative, localist kind of guy, and he talks about that, how important it is to like limit not only the influence of big government but also the influence of big corporations. And so like you said, I think the distributists generally speaking are much more comfortable with the government kind of setting up certain structures, whether those are tax structures or like other kinds of regulations that are in favor of the smaller businesses. And I mean, we used to, in this country, we have had distributist policies in the past. I don't think a lot of people truly like understand that, because a lot of the time the critique of distributism is that it's like a bunch of armchair philosophers, like, and they're just like kind of waxing and waning poetically about what like ideal utopia they would like to live in. But the reality is that like the Homestead Act that we had in this country that ceded federal lands to people who were willing to move onto those lands, develop those lands, farm those lands. I mean, that was a distributist policy, right? And so like the government that wasn't government taking anybody's land. It already owned that land, and it still owns something like 70% of most of the land like out west, right? So there is potential opportunity for that. But again, then you have to deal with the fact that like most people are currently moving from rural places to urban places. So I don't know if that kind of an idea would be as popular today, just due to the decrease in kind of um, rural living in general. But even that has somewhat to do with the fact that how many of those people are moving to the cities solely because they want jobs at major corporations that have chosen to headquarter there. Like we have kind of destroyed our small towns and cities by empowering our bigger companies. So it's a complicated issue, and there's a lot to untangle. And I don't really pretend to be an authority on the topic. I feel like I know enough to talk about it, but I really would hope that what our party can do, and what like other parties can do, hopefully, or other activists, or people out there trying to spread messages like you are, like we can kind of maybe get people talking about this, so that maybe people who actually are in current positions of authority might take it up. And then also we need to encourage our own people, like I said earlier, to get involved in their cities and towns. We should be running for city council, we should be running for library board, we should be running for school board, right? Because I mean those things do matter, and I don't think that I don't think the average person thinks about how much they do matter. So sorry for kind of taking us down a tangent there, but
No, no, I think you brought up a couple of interesting things there. One of the things you brought up is rural living and the importance of rural living and agrarianism to the distributist philosophy. And I've always felt very uncomfortable with this energy on the left a lot of the times, that urban living is just progress, right? There's this sense on the left a lot of times that we're all just gradually moving towards bigger and bigger cities with more and more people in smaller and smaller places, and that's just inevitably what's going to happen. And I've never loved any of the options of living available. I don't love the deeply rural. I don't love the very auto dependent suburban enclaves. And I also don't love, the smog filled mega cities where you can walk down the street surrounded by people and still be alone.
mm-hmm.
I feel
Yeah.
like we need more nuance when it comes to the rural urban debate. And Democrats have been very just uncritically pro urban in this conversation.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you bring up that, because I don't think, historically speaking, I mean there were periods where like people have always lived very rurally. They've always lived in very urban environments, but like we also had this kind of this concept at one point or another of like a village, of like a town. And I think for a lot of us, like that really isn't an option, because so many of those places are dying, as people are moving out of them, as businesses are moving out of them. So you've got the self-sufficiency, I'm gonna move into the woods and grow all my own food kind of homesteading, and then you've got I'm gonna be a high-powered attorney at a law firm in downtown Manhattan. But the reality is, like, where, like, I could rattle off, I've lived in the Northeast, I've lived in the Southeast, I could rattle off 10 or 15 cities that I think are beautiful small cities in the middle of nowhere, like that everybody would be like, they wouldn't have ever heard of it, and that's fine. But like, I think as people leave those places and those cities start to kind of decay, I mean, they're gonna become they're going to become ghost towns, and they're going to have a lot of vacant rundown houses, and they're not going to have the vibrancy they once had. I mean, I think of a lot of places in New England actually that are probably many of which are probably still thriving at this point. But I don't know if they will be 50 or 100 years from now. I actually spent about 6 months living in Exeter, New Hampshire.
Okay.
And that is such a beautiful, beautiful city. It's a nice small town, relatively speaking to what urban city dwellers think of when I say city. And Exeter might survive a little bit longer than others because of Phillips Academy there. But there's a lot of places like that all over this country that are just kind of falling apart. And I think we need a much more community focused mindset to try to revitalize that kind of thing. And we need a small business oriented economy to for people to have any feeling that they can stay in those towns,
Mm.
right? Because you're not just gonna get a job working at Google if you live in Sylacauga, Alabama. You know what I mean? Like you'd virtually have to move to some other major like metropolitan area. So uh, that's something that I wish I had like a concrete solution for, other than saying like we should have more small businesses. But I think like when there's nowhere to work in your town, how are you expected to like stay there and pay your bills? You know what I mean? It's not. So it doesn't seem like a sustainable solution,
And I
to
do
just
think there
continue.
are
Yeah.
some concrete solutions I've found. I talked to intellectual property abolitionists of the Pirate Party. I think that could go a long way if we changed intellectual property law. One of my favorite authors on the subject, Stacey Mitchell, she talks about franchise autonomy. That's one of her big issues, which is where you could be the owner of a McDonald's and you'd have slightly more power than usual uh, of your particular McDonald's, free from corporate influence of McDonald's at large. So it would be a lot closer to a small business, and you would also make more money. So the money wouldn't be exiting the community and going to wherever the heck McDonald's headquarters is located. It would be staying in that neighborhood. She also suggests, just flat out taxing outside corporations and creating local small business funds to help local communities, which I think is a blunt instrument, but it's an obvious solution I think we haven't really been doing.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You raised the point about kind of taking the money out of the communities, and I think that's a very, very, um, very big issue, because as you have these fewer and fewer larger and larger corporations, it's like all of the money that is made at Walmart is basically going somewhere in Kansas to the Walton family. Like it's like, and so like that's not good for that community, right? Because you want your money to be bought and spent locally. And so I know I was kind of like lamenting before like the situation and being like, but what can we do? I mean, like I don't think that I'm the person to come up with the macroeconomic solutions of how to restructure our economy. That said, I know what I do personally. And that's like I do my best to, shop locally. If there's a if there's a farmer's market instead of a grocery store, I'm going to go to the farmer's market. If one thing a lot of people don't, I think a lot of people don't think about is, how if we're going to the grocery store and we're buying certain things, like like depend like especially today, maybe 5 years ago it would be a little bit different before some of the inflation we've seen, but like you go into the grocery store today and you're paying $6 for a pound of ground beef. If you can afford a little extra, you can buy it from a farmer in your area. And we've got like, and they'll actually, I don't think people realize how far they'll deliver. We've got a guy here in Georgia who I buy meat from. He's about 2.5 hours away. But he ships me, if I buy a big enough order, it's like $250 or whatever. If you spend that in one shot, he'll ship it for free. And so I've got a chest freezer, and I just, buy like, 25 pounds at a time, you know,
Great.
and so, but like, there's that aspect of it where you got to really, I think, be intentional with your purchasing decisions. It's like it's very easy to go on Amazon and get, whatever trinket shipped with 2-day shipping, but we have to be a little more we can be a little more thoughtful about that. I'm not gonna be prescriptive in my language, but I will say, like, there are things that you can do. You know what I mean? You can, instead of calling up the plumber that's got like a national presence or a regional presence, there's apps like Nextdoor, or like, probably Facebook. You can find a community group, and you can be intentional about hiring self-employed people, so that's another thing that I try to do. I never use like, there's a company around here, Mr. Plumber, and not to disparage Mr. Plumber, they do a good job. I used them once in the past.
They're
But
around here too.
oh, they are. Okay. So they're national. Yeah. Like, and so no, I have nothing bad to say publicly about them. But they are a national company. And like, I I think it was a very convenient. One of the services that they offered was, in fact, their convenience, that it was very easy for me to find them and call them up. But in recent years, I have been more intentional about trying to find local self-employed people, partially because I want that money to stay in my community. I want it to stay in my town. And so, I feel like I'm kind of ranting about that at this point, but
No, no,
that's
you're
just
good.
kind of, that's one strategy, I guess, that you don't need a government solution
I
to start
agree, and I
implementing
I
in your
also
life.
think that's in a lot of ways the right way to do it. We've lost a lot of these traditions that we used to have back in the day of people making their canning their own canned goods, or having the tub of lard that they reuse next to the oven. A lot of those traditions existed for efficiency reasons that we've let go of, and there's a lot of waste now that
Hmm.
we just externalize. Like, economically speaking, it's an externality, all this waste that happens. A lot of it, the waste becomes plastic packaging,
Right.
from the national lines that we buy from. So another value that the American Solidarity Party talks about that I don't hear in discussion in the duopoly, so to speak, is subsidiarity. What does subsidiarity mean to you?
So subsidiarity, to put it succinctly, is the concept that um, things, issues should be handled at the most local level possible. Um, so what this principle, is, some people might have heard the term subsidiary before in the context of like corporations. So like a subsidiary is something that is like below something else in a hierarchy, right? And so when we talk about subsidiarity, what we're talking about is like kind of that idea of taking it to that lowest level, right? We want to kind of let whatever is the lowest level that can handle an issue handle it. And so, uh, in the context of like our society, that would generally be like, the family would probably be the most local level, and then from there you might go into, depending on if you have like, maybe like a town or a city or a community, depending on exactly like what your structure is like where you are. Then you would escalate to, any kind of regional municipality if one exists, or statewide kind of, and then finally national. So there are some areas that are like incredibly clear cut. I think most people will agree, like, the family should not be handling national defense, right? Nor
Mm.
should the state be handling like, the morals we teach our children. So I think those kinds of things are like very clear cut and very obvious. Where it gets a little more difficult, I think, is when we're talking about public goods and services, and things that we believe we should be offering to everyone universally to advance the common good. So a very clear example of this is education. Um, I know we always hear certain people talking about how we need to eliminate the Department of Education. Other people love the Department of Education, and the question is, okay, well, is that an issue that the federal government really should be involved in? And I think most people in the American Solidarity Party would probably say some combination of yes and no. Like, I think, and the reason I'm stressing this one is because I think it'll shed an important light on like what I think subsidiarity is, because I think a lot of people get subsidiarity wrong. So subsidiarity is not just like pure localism, right? It's not, but it's also not big government. It's just saying there are roles for higher levels of government, there are roles for lower levels of government, and we should try to find that right level, right? Because if a town can handle something, there's no reason for the state to tell them what to do, right? But the challenge then becomes, well, what if the town can't handle it and the state is unwilling to, or the town thinks they can handle it and the state thinks they can't? And so those are the things you have to negotiate between. Um, but I go back to this idea of like this education issue, because I think most people agree that the fact that the federal Department of Education exists and can move money between the states is actually kind of a good thing, because we wouldn't want huge financial disparities in terms of resources between California and Mississippi. Otherwise, kids in Mississippi are just not going to get as good of an education. What the folks in the party would disagree with would be a lot of the strings that come attached with that money.
Mm.
So I think you can separate the I'm going to run this thing from the social insurance aspect of it. And I think you can maybe get more people on board. And I think that would be in certain circumstances where like folks in our party would kind of fall on that, would be like, I like the fact that, speaking personally, right? I like the fact that there are states where we have large corporations, where we have incredibly high income earners that pay more into the system that benefits people who don't have access to those resources and don't have those kinds of incomes. Like, I think that there's a degree of redistribution that unfortunately is necessary because of the economy we live in. But that doesn't mean that I want the federal government to be telling New York State or Mississippi how they like what they should be teaching their students, how they should be teaching their students, how they should be running their schools. There's a lot of like hot button cultural issues and stuff that are always prevalent, like and so I don't really want the federal government weighing in on those things, because the cultures of Mississippi and New York are different, right? And I mean, obviously that is all caveated with like within reason, right? Like, there's obviously certain things like we don't want, like, if this were like 1957, like we wouldn't want, like, it was good that the schools were forced to integrate, right? Like, so you don't want to take any principle you can take too far, I think. But I'd say that's kind of the general way that I would summarize it.
I agree, and that's actually I'm glad you chose education as the example to talk about there, because that's exactly the issue I think about when I hear about subsidiarity. One definition I've heard of subsidiarity in the past that it sounds like you're gravitating towards is that it tries to empower the local level without taking away their autonomy, without taking away their decision-making power. And that sounds like the philosophy at play there with education, right? The federal government has a role for addressing the inequalities in funding, but maybe we don't like so much the standardized test requirements that get imposed on a lot of schools. I personally am not a fan of those requirements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think any of those mandates where it's like, we're going to address your needs, but we're going to do XYZ, whatever. Like, if that was done in a marriage, like, we would recall that like financial abuse,
Mm.
like, and so I don't know why, like, we can't take that kind of concept and just like kind of look at some of these other relationships, other institutions with kind of the same lens and say like, yeah, like, I if there's I get to an extent, hey, we have this initiative and we want you to, if you want to do this in your school or you want to do this in your state, we're going to give you money to pay for it because we think it's a good initiative. That is very different to me than, if you don't have a mandatory seatbelt law, you don't get highway funding, right?
Mm.
Like, like, I think, and I don't know, I'm trying to remember. I think it actually, there was something like that.
Almost exactly, I think. Yeah.
Almost exactly. And I think New Hampshire might be one of the states that said we won't take it. And they're like one of the states where you don't have to wear a helmet on a motorcycle. I could be
That
wrong about
would be
that, but
that would be us. We are the
yeah.
ones who refuse to wear a helmet on our motorcycle.
Yeah, poor personal choice, but I mean, you know,
And it is that is the sort of the beautiful tension I think in subsidiarity is on one hand, a lot of this funding comes with strings attached. And I have conversations with Democrats sometimes here in New Hampshire, where they're talking about centralizing education funding as a progressive move. And I'm like, well, in a lot of ways, I see what you're talking about, but I don't love those strings attached. I don't love that loss of community power. And I think what's interesting is one issue that gets talked about a lot in state and local politics is unfunded mandates. And unfunded mandates are, I think, the reverse of subsidiarity. They're telling people on the lower levels of government, here's what we mandate you do, but they're not giving them the resources to achieve it. So I think
yeah,
that's maybe a good way to explain it is it's the opposite of an unfunded mandate.
right. Yeah, I prefer funded non-mandates. So
Exactly.
yeah, but I think that I like the way that you characterized that of empowering the local level. I think that that is really like to acknowledge, and I've heard other people say very similar things. It's like it's an acknowledgement that the higher levels exist in service of the lower levels,
Mm.
right? And so they shouldn't be usurping the authority of the lower levels, provided that the lower levels can do it. And I think that's the challenge. It's just like it's like the challenge of, when we talk about, I'll use a hot button social issue here, gun control and gun rights, right? Um, I am one of the things that's interesting to me about that, I'm very much supportive of the right to bear arms, right? Personally. Um, but I think one of the things that, when we talk about gun control, one of the things that like makes the case for gun control is just irresponsible gun ownership.
Mm.
And so, I think there's this concept, I think, that we've kind of lost. And this gets back to what we were talking a little bit earlier about freedom, this idea that like rights, we have rights exist, but rights come with responsibilities. And so you cannot divorce your right from your responsibility, or you're living in some kind of libertine hellscape, right? Like, and that's just the reality. And so, I think what has given me pause sometimes is when I've talked to people about guns and they make comments or describe how they keep their firearms, and like, then they're upset at the notion that somebody would want to intervene in that.
Mm.
But like, I also know that they're engaging in practices that are not safe,
Right.
right?
Yeah, and I
So
think
like the notion of like, you know safe storage of weapons, and then, those kinds of things, it's like those are things that should be trained and ingrained in us from an early age in this country, because we do have this right.
and I
and
think
and
that's
like we don't
the
want to do. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. We don't.
No, no. I think that's kind of the best approach too, is a lot of the countries that Democrats will point to as countries with less gun violence, right? Places like I think it was Switzerland, they have tons of guns in Switzerland. And sometimes
Mhm.
conservatives will use that as almost a counter argument. They have tons of guns, but all of the people who own the guns got it through a civic militia training program where they're very strictly taught how to use the gun, how to store the gun. There's a very strict requirement of training and operation. It's like having to go into the military. It's that level of discipline in order to become a firearm owner. So they have a
Mhm.
ton of guns, but everybody there knows in detail the risks of the firearm ownership.
Yeah, and I think if we had that kind of a culture and that kind of a training in our country, we wouldn't see these kind of ridiculous calls for abolishing firearms and like
Mm,
taking everybody like I mean that is a fringe position, but it does exist, right? And I think that comes from quite frankly just an ignorance of guns and a fear of guns and like I grew up in an area where gun ownership was not common, and like I've definitely heard that attitude from some of the people in that area that like, oh, well, we just need to get rid of firearms altogether, that kind
mm,
of thing. And that's not only not realistic, but it comes from a position of like an ignorance, I think, of how these things work and like what they're even used for sometimes. Like I don't think people even appreciate like the fact that there are still people out there that subsistence hunt for their food, you
mm,
know, like so I think those, but kind of bringing it back to the other point, like with that right, like there is a responsibility, and I think we probably should be training people at a young age to respect firearms and to handle them responsibly. Um, and that my the challenge is when you get the very loaded, charged political feelings without like the practical real world experience, and it's like I even know people who are passionate about that one in favor of guns that don't own guns. And I had a friend that was like that, and I went shooting with him once at the firing range, and he was engaging in some very unsafe practices because he didn't know how to handle a firearm. Um, but he was very passionate about it, like, but it's not his fault he didn't know. Like his family didn't ever use them, like they didn't own them, so why would he know? I was taught how to shoot when I was about 12. My father taught me with 22 caliber rifles, um, but it was the way that he taught me. It was much more of like he taught me the safety of it, but it was also much more of like a recreational thing versus like a personal safety or hunting or something like that. Um, so, I don't know. I'm sure there's people that are going to listen to this who think that maybe I don't understand where they're coming from because they were raised in a different environment with maybe the personal safety element is more important to them. So when I suggest that safe storage and locking firearms up is necessary to be a responsible gun owner, maybe their first thought is, well, how am I supposed to protect my family if I can't get my gun quick enough?
mm,
I I mean, I've heard that argument, but I also like know that like, the vast majority of gun deaths are self-inflicted, whether intentional or accidental. And it's like all you need is a young child to find it, or all you need is a teenager who's depressed to find it. And like that is, far more likely than you getting into a shootout in your living room because you're living a real life version of the strangers. You know what I mean? So
mm.
like that's something that I have difficulty with, and that's kind of where I was going before when I talked about like kind of the irresponsible gun ownership is like, when somebody has just a loaded handgun in the nightstand kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know, it's a tough issue.
Yeah. And I
um
think that also kind of brings us back to the coherence of American Solidarity Party politics is I think there's in general a sort of a communitarian ethic or a recommitment to our institutions and to the role of the common good in society as
Mhm.
opposed to I think our culture these days is very, very individualist in
Mhm.
every aspect, culturally, economically. We've embraced the individual wholeheartedly. And I think there's been some good with that, but I think we do need a sort of a return to the common good. And I think that's the through line of a lot of these issues, gun control, as well as, stronger social safety net, an embrace of community economics. I think all of those are can be contrasted with individualism in some way.
Yeah, I the actually for a long time the ASP did not take a position on guns at all because it was such a hot button issue even amongst our own members. And this past cycle, we actually did add language to the platform about firearms, and I think it takes a very practical education based approach, which is like kind of what I hopefully communicated when I was talking, because I fully support that myself. But I didn't actually write that or work with the people who wrote it, but
Right,
it
right.
was it was well written, and it really does take, I think, a more what we try to do in most of our positions, I think, is we try to take the kind of more nuanced position when we can, when it isn't like a life or death issue. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
anyway, I think that's one of those, but it's a very complicated issue, and it's a very very emotionally charged one.
I
So
think a another issue I wanted to ask you about, because I know the American Solidarity Party is very closely tied to Catholicism,
mhm.
maybe not inherently, but a lot of these values we're talking about, distributist social thought, subsidiarity, a lot of that is Catholic. I wanted to ask, what is the American Solidarity Party's position on things like gay marriage?
Yeah, so the party takes a very traditional position on marriage. So the platform does talk about marriage being like the basis of the family, and being the family being founded on the institution of like a one man, one woman marriage.
Hmm.
So we do take a very countercultural position on that issue. Um, I think I guess one thing I'd like to stress, just because you brought up the connections to Catholicism, this is a lot of the platform is lines up neatly with Catholic social teaching, but I personally would not go so far as to say it is based on Catholic social teaching. It comes out of a tradition politically that's known as Christian democracy.
Hmm.
So some of your listeners may be familiar with Angela Merkel. She was a high level politician in Germany several years ago. She was a member of the Christian Democratic Union in Germany, the CDU. That was their Christian Democratic Party. Christian democracy basically came out of World War II, and it was widespread in Europe, and then it spread through South America. We in this country have not had a Christian Democratic Party, but that is the political tradition that the ASP was founded in. So it was founded in 2011 as the Christian Democratic Party USA, and then it was renamed the American Solidarity Party in 2012, and that change was informed in part by the solidarity movement in Poland, which, if your listeners are not familiar with, was instrumental in ending the communist regime there. So the Solidarity Union was kind of one of the big groups there that kind of ended the Polish communist regime. So
Okay. Yeah, and that I understand whenever I look at international politics, the largest parties are usually they have a more conservative party. they have a more maybe a left party or a green party or something like that. And then somewhere in the middle, where sort of the liberals might live, a lot of times they have a Christian Democratic Party. And it's weird that in the US, we don't have that presence of the Christian Democrats as much.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and they actually, I know there's been it has kind of struggled to take in some countries, and I think that might just be because of like a much more fiercely individualistic culture, you know.
Mm.
So like I know there was a Christian Democratic Party in Canada for a little while, but they have not existed for some time now. And I think even in parts of like Oceania and New Zealand and Australia, they may have had Christian Democratic parties in the past.
Mm.
But yeah, it isn't a widespread political philosophy really outside of Europe and Latin America. I mean, in Latin America and in Europe, the Christian Democratic parties have actually like been a fairly strong force at times throughout history, you know. Um, and I mean, I think part of that's due to the fact that it did come out of World War II Europe. Like, so to spread to like Asia or Africa would, you know, not to say there's never been any similar movements in those countries or that there's never been any Christian Democratic parties, because there have been African Christian Democratic parties, but it's that I think there might be some cultural barriers there um, to adopting it. But yeah, I mean, it comes out of who's the other one? The other big one that historically was Kuiper. I don't know if you've heard of Kuiper. He was um, a Dutch politician back in the mid to late 19th century, and so he was he predated Belloc and Chesterton by a few decades. And he was actually a Calvinist, so it's not. It is there is some Protestant influence on it as well. But I mean, the movement itself, the political movement, is is one that does not require any confessional statements of faith. So in
Mm.
that sense, it is secular. Now, it might be too influenced by religion and maybe have too many religiously coded terms for some people to be comfortable with it. But it is a secular, non-sectarian kind of philosophy.
And I do think it is capable of reaching people who aren't religious because I'm not religious. I'm an
Mm.
atheist, but I'm still very much drawn to a lot of the principles of this party. One other issue I wanted to ask you about too was the labor movement. What is the American Solidarity Party's relationship to unions and labor?
Yeah. So in terms of like direct relationships, we have several members of our party who are members of unions. I think, you know, um, the unions themselves are really kind of hard to break into. You know, so we don't have a lot of direct relationships with the unions themselves. But we do have an appeal to union members. We've got a lot of people who are in unions who are part of the party, and as a general rule, we would like to strengthen labor unions. We would like to improve collective bargaining and those kinds of things. So you know the money piece of it always gets complicated in American politics. So you know the unions themselves have been allowed to engage in political activism, and that has been a little bit disappointing to me, just looking at the history of it, because I think the unions should have much more widespread appeal. And I know that there's a lot of conservatives out there that are uncomfortable with unions because of their loyalty basically to the Democratic Party.
Mm.
Um, and that's it's a real disappointment, because they're basically alienating a lot of people that
I
they
mean, half
shouldn't
the
be.
country, more or less.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, you know, I think it's and it's also challenging because there is the elite interests at play as well within like the Republican Party and within kind of the Republican um, media ecosphere, right? Where they want to, like, highlight those things, encourage their members, their party members or their viewers or the listeners of those media outlets, um, to basically not want to organize, not want to participate in unions. And so, because it's a kind of a two-pronged approach where they want to make sure that um, on a political level that the corporations can kind of quote unquote deal with the unions, right? But then they're also trying to shape the public opinion to ensure that when a vote to unionize occurs, that it's less likely to pass. And the unions really aren't doing themselves any favors in that regard, because I think where the leaders of those unions come from is they recognize the power of the political levers, and so they're betting on that as opposed to trying to bet on the people.
Mm. They're focusing more on what they can win politically than they are on what they can win through a union itself.
Yeah, I think they're looking at it and they're going, the Republican Party is trying to make it harder for us to operate. The Democratic Party says they support us, so we're going to make sure Democrats get elected. Well, then the Republican Party and Fox News, Newsmax, Breitbart, all those conservative outlets, then they report like, oh, unions donated to Democrats, and then the Republican voter says, well, I don't want to pay union dues if they're going to give my money to Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you
I,
know
I 100% agree with that.
yeah, so it's I would have a very different strategy if I were in their shoes, but I am not. So
So that actually, I think, was all of the specific questions I had for you. I wanted to ask, is there anything else you'd like to say about the American Solidarity Party that you want the average person who doesn't know much about them to hear?
yeah, so I'd say that, like, one of the things that I why I'm involved the way I am, and one of the things that I love about the party is the culture of the party. We do draw in people from across the political spectrum, and I have had wonderful conversations with people who I never would have met otherwise. And it has, by and large, been in a very productive civil way that has challenged some of the things I came into the party believing, and has allowed me to grow in my own views, because the course of our political discourse today is just so toxic and everybody is always defensive and combative. And what I have found is, like, when you remove yourself from that context, it really changes the way that you approach those conversations and the way other people approach those conversations. So I feel like, in terms of, like, obviously, like every other political party that has ever or will ever exist, there are internal political disagreements, but those disagreements are not uh, in a way where, like, you the, they're not in a way where you're questioning the other person's motives or loyalties, generally
Mhm.
speaking. And that's not the way that our national political discourse goes. I guess the only other thing that I'd like to share before we go is, if your listeners are interested in learning a little bit more about some of the things that we talked about, I would definitely recommend that they pick up the book Toward a Truly Free Market by John Maydai. Um,
Mhm.
Also, the book Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher is another great one. And The Servile State by Hilaire Belloc. Those are three excellent books that talk about not just economics, but like political economics, like economic philosophy, in a way that is different than this just rote, this is the laws of nature kind of thing.
I
So,
can vouch. Those are all great books. I actually have all of those books.
oh, cool. Nice.
Um,
Nice.
so where can people reach you? I can actually, if you don't have it right now, I can put it in the description also. But where is a good place for people to reach out and learn more about the ASP?
So if they want to learn more about the party, they can go to solidarity-party.org and they
Mhm.
can look at our website. If they want to learn more about our presidential nominee, they can go to petersonsky.com, and there they can read some of his blog posts. They can sign up for his email list. I'm not sure exactly when this is going out. We're recording it about 3 weeks before the election. So,
Mhm.
um, but yeah, so that we're going to be on the ballot in, I believe, 7 states, and we will be a write-in in 30 some odd other states. It looks like so. Um, and then, yeah, then uh, I host a podcast myself, for the
Oh,
party. So you can listen to the Pelican Brief wherever you get podcasts. I have not put out an episode in a little while, but I have been recording for about the last year. So we have a good runway ahead of us, and we're going to start putting them out over the next month. And then we'll continue from there. So I've got about 22 episodes out.
I'll check that out for sure.
And then yeah, if you have any questions or you want to get in touch with me personally, you can always email me at wfleming@solidarity-party.org.
All right. Thank you for coming on, man.
Thank you for having me, Dominic. I really appreciated you having me on, and I appreciated the conversation.